The topic being addressed today is titled, "A Matter Requiring an Examination of Conscience for those who believe in nonviolence and for those who believe in justified violence." Part 1. We all know, either by reading the Bible or by seeing the Hollywood movie with Gregory Peck and Susan Hayworth, the story of David and Bathsheba. The story goes back about 1,000 years before Christ. It takes place between 993 and 991, so we are told by scholars. But it is not written in the book of Samuel until approximately 630 BC. It is an ancient religious and moral narrative whose plotline people seem to have been drawn to almost magnetically for nearly 3,000 years. There's something within human beings that knows the message in this story is fearsomely true, even if its characters in the story are perhaps not historically precise. The story lives on to this day, because to this day, the truth and the tragedy and the evil it encapsulates live on in the human condition. To recall the story, let us just for a moment think about what precisely it is that's being said. One night, 3,000 years ago in Jerusalem, King David is walking upon his rooftop when he spots a beautiful woman bathing nearby. David asks his servants about her and is told she is Bathsheba, the wife of Uriah, Hittite, one of David's soldiers. Despite her marital status, David, who at the time has 6 wives and about 300 concubines, summons Bathsheba to his palace and has sexual intercourse with her. Bathsheba later discovers she is pregnant and informs David. David's response is to attempt to cover up his sin. David commands Uriah to report back to him from the front lines. Bathsheba's husband dutifully answers the king's summons. David sends him home that night, hoping that Uriah will sleep with Bathsheba and thus provide a cover for the pregnancy. Instead of obeying David's orders, Uriah sleeps in the quarters of the palace servants, refusing to enjoy a respite with Bathsheba while his fellow warriors are on the battlefield and still in harm's way. Bathsheba does not really know what is going on. David, the next night, gets Uriah drunk and sends him home to his wife Bathsheba. Uriah does not go home, but again sleeps with the servants in order to stay in solidarity with his military comrades in battle. So it becomes apparent that David and Bathsheba's adultery cannot be covered up in the way that David has planned. David then goes to his plan B. He commands his military leader, Joab, to place Uriah in the front lines of battle against the Ammonites, and then to purposefully have the troops fall back from him, leaving Uriah defenseless and exposed to enemy attack. Joab, like all obedient soldiers, follows the king's directive, and Uriah is listed as killed in battle. Bathsheba then marries David after a period of mourning and gives birth to a son. All is now well and peaceful in David's kingdoms of Judah and Israel. No one knows, and no one can ever know, what he has done. All the evidence is destroyed. There is, however, one who does know, the Lord God. When David and Bathsheba's child is born, God sends the prophet Nathan to confront David about the evil he has orchestrated. To do this, Nathan uses the following parable to reveal the truth to David, who is now living in a state of grave moral self-deception. The parable is this. A rich man took a poor man's only ewe lamb and killed it in order to satisfy his own desires and needs, to impress a guest in his house. The rich man did this even though he had many flocks of his own. At this point, David, a former shepherd, became so enraged on hearing this story, which he thinks is true, that he responded, "As surely as the Lord God lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for the lamb 4 times over, because he did such a thing." Nathan then points to David and speaks the soul-chilling words, "You are the man. You have struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword, and then taken his wife for your own, and killed him with the sword of the Ammonites." Nathan's words cut into King David like the blade of a 2-edged sword. Indeed, Nathan's words are sharper than any 2-edged sword, because they pierce to the division of soul and spirit, joint and marrow, revealing the thoughts and the intentions and the wickedness of King David's heart, King David himself. They reveal to him with certainty what before that moment he refuses to see and to acknowledge, namely, I am a murderer. But how can David be a murderer? He was chosen by God to be king. He did not slay Uriah with his famous slingshot or sword. King David did nothing except send a message to Joab, the commander of his warriors, to create the situation where Uriah would be left isolated and defenseless when the lethal attack of the Ammonites came. At the moment of Uriah's death, in fact, King David was back in Jerusalem, just going about his daily routine. Yet for 3,000 years, anyone upon hearing this story would say King David murdered Uriah. David refuses to see this himself until the prophet Nathan creatively exposes to David's own view and conscience that he is in fact a murderer. Perhaps a comparable moral situation would be this. Let's say the president of a country has a daughter who has a baby outside of marriage. The president thinks that if this becomes public knowledge, he will not get elected again and will thereby lose the status, the power, the prestige for which he has given his entire life. So he has one of his loyal flunkies who is on his payroll bribe and blackmail the new baby's nanny so she will suffocate the baby, thereby assuring that the newborn infant would be unknown to history and never give him any trouble. Is the president a murderer? Of course he is, even though he never touched or saw the child. In order to satisfy his lust for power and his lust to retain power, and perhaps his lust for prestige, comfort, and wealth, he created the plan that killed the baby and set it into motion. After that, well, all that was necessary was for others to execute it. And so also was the case with King David. Both of these are murderers. King David and our hypothetical president lusted after something, and murdering the innocent and defenseless was what each did to satisfy their desire, their particular lust. They are as much murderers as Cain. Indeed, spiritually and morally, they are blood brothers of Cain. Another situation morally parallel to King David's would be that of a doctor whose patients put their trust in her to treat their illnesses. The doctor has the medicines available that she absolutely knows will, in all probability, arrest a particular illness. She can legally prescribe these medications for those of her patients who have the malady, but intentionally, not inadvertently, she declines to prescribe them. She does this not for any medical reason, but rather because her primary desire is to keep her job and hence her standard of living intact. At the moment of her decision, powerful medical and political and economic forces have been embarked on their own agenda and do not want these particular medications employed, and have shown that they would brutally attack her if she prescribed them. So she does not. The consequences that flow from this choice are that 80% of her patients with this particular illness, who could have been saved by these legally obtainable medicines, die. Now, morally, murder is defined as the act whereby a person intentionally and unjustifiably participates in the destruction of a human life. For example, Cain, King David, or our hypothetical president. But so also our hypothetical doctor. However, if the situation were that the doctor could not prescribe the needed medicines because the ruler of a country embargoed the sale and distribution of them, then the doctor would not have any moral culpability for not prescribing them or for her patients dying. That ruler would be morally responsible for murder at the moment each of these patients died, even though, like King David, he is miles away from the place of death and going about his usual daily routine. Notwithstanding the distance between the ruler and the deceased at the moment of death, that ruler is a murderer. Let me conclude with three quotations. The first is from Thomas Merton. Merton writes, "The real crimes of violence today are not committed by a few desperate teenagers in the slums, but in the war offices, the ministries of defense, the corporate boardrooms, in which no one has ever to see blood unless his secretary gets a nosebleed. Modern mass murder is not directly visible like individual murder. It is abstract, corporate, businesslike, free of guilt feelings, and therefore 1,000 times more deadly and effective. It is this white-collar, polite, massively organized murder machine that threatens humanity with destruction. Our church fails to see this. It shudders at a mugging or a killing where a mess is made on our doorstep. But it blesses and canonizes the antiseptic violence of corporately organized murder. Because corporately organized murder is respectable, efficient, clean, and above all, profitable. A second reflection by Thomas Merton, followed by a comment by me. Merton. Murder does not become other than murder when it becomes mass murder. I would parenthetically add, nor does murder become other than murder when it is normalized by a society, a state, or a religion. Finally, let me conclude with a quotation from Albert Camus. Quote, "All I ask is that murder be called by its right name, murder." This is Emmanuel Charles MacArthur.